My name is Stephen Cowden. I am a lecturer in social work at Coventry University. One of the research areas I've become involved in is the whole area of religious fundamentalism and its impact in the context of social work, social policy. Should we shut the door?
Yeah. The windows are open, yeah?
And I'm part of the Feminist Dissent collective, and Rashmi will say something more about what that group is all about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I'm Rashmi Varma, and I teach in the Department of Comparative Literary Studies and English at the University of Warwick. And I teach courses in post-colonial literature, post-colonial theory, and feminist theory and transnational feminism. And like Stephen, I'm part of this new journal which we have launched a couple of years ago called Feminist Dissent, which is based at the University of Warwick, but consists of an editorial collective. We are 13 of us, which comprises artists, writers, academics, and activists. If you go to our website, you can see all the people involved in our collective. And this is a journal that has come out of a group called Women Against Fundamentalism, which was formed around the Rushdie affair, when Rushdie's The Satanic Verses was published in the late 80s. And there were widespread demonstrations against Rushdie's novel, asking for the novel to be banned, for Rushdie, for the fatwa to be carried out against Rushdie. A group of women came together under the banner of WAF. Some of them had been working before the Rushdie affair on issues such as the rise, of the Christian right and the attack on abortion rights and so on in Ireland and in other parts of the world. And around this affair, there was feminists started focusing on the ways in which within Muslim communities and other immigrant communities, the question of religious fundamentalism was rising and was becoming a big issue. So the group lasted until about 2009, and then it sort of broke up. So Feminist Dissent, the idea was to revive that and to publish and to create a platform for the discussion of issues of gender and fundamentalism, but also discussion of issues like secularism, religious rights, feminist theory, civil liberties, religious freedom, and so on. So do take a look at our journal. This is the website. If you click on the links, you can go to the actual issues. We also have a call for papers. We would love to receive book reviews, film clips, all kinds of things. So please do look at us. And we also have flyers here if you want to find out more about what we do at Feminist Dissent. Okay, so in some ways, we are talking today from our experience of the work we have done with this journal, but also out of our research. And the format of this workshop, the way we have planned it, is that Stephen will speak briefly about the importance of the category of religious fundamentalism. I will follow that up with a discussion of how within Marxist feminism, there's been this kind of resurgence of the theories of social reproduction, the work that women primarily do outside of formal production processes. And I'm going to look at how religious fundamentalism has been a key missing category from those analyses. And then we have a case study from an actual case that this group called Southall Black Sisters, which is based in London, and it's a refuge for women who are victims of domestic violence, black and minority ethnic women. And this is an actual case that they are dealing with. So we thought we'll share the case study and get people's responses to that, and then sort of just open up the discussion. So, on to you.
Okay, so I'm going to try and just look at some of the sort of definitional issues and what about sort of really what is fundamentalism. Yeah, so trying to
put F5.
F5. Yeah. Right, thanks.
Can you see it?
Right, thank you. So basically, just as Rashmi said, one of the things that there are many debates about, for example, issues of gender, reproduction, about capitalism, about terrorism and counter-terrorism that are taking place now in all sorts of contexts. One of the things that we feel is absolutely missing from so many of those discussions is this category of religious fundamentalism. We believe it's a very important analytical category that allows us to understand what's going on in many different contexts. One of the things about the category of religious fundamentalism, we talk about fundamentalism as a rising category across different religions. That shifts a lot of the discussion away from Islam, yeah, which is in European countries, Australia and the US, the whole focus around fundamentalism is a discussion about Islam. But we want to generalise that discussion and talk about Sikh fundamentalism. We want to talk about Hindu fundamentalism. There's even discussion of Buddhist fundamentalism as well as Christian fundamentalism. So it's that category of fundamentalism that we see is really important. Now, what are fundamentalist movements about? Yeah? What are they about? Our argument in feminist dissent is that fundamental movements are authoritarian movements of the political right. While Islamist movements are attacked by both the state and white supremacist and nationalist or neo-fascist groups, and sometimes, in many contexts, defended by the left, we see that neo-fascist, white supremacist right-wing movements and religious fundamentalist right-wing movements as having much in common with each other. In actual fact, we see them as feeding off each other, nurturing and feeding off each other. They need each other. Yeah? Very famous Algerian sociologist Mariam Healy Lucas, who who's lived in Algeria for many years, then was living in France, now lives in India. She's argued that one of the central features of fundamentalist movements is their desire to control women. This is a key locus, and she gives a whole series of examples there. Islamic fundamentalists, Christian fundamentalists, the Hindu BJP, which is now the government of India. Equally, the Australian theologian Patricia Madigan has characterised fundamentalist movements as neo-patriarchal. That is, they use religious texts to justify essentially modern versions of heterosexuality and male power in the family. So this is a sort of a key feature of fundamentalist movements, is they construct themselves as simply reiterating primordial truths. In actual fact, they're very modernist movements. They are engaged in dogmatic and highly selective reinterpretations of religious texts, often which violate the fundamental principles of those faith traditions that they speak in the name of. Now, that's a kind of feature of it. So, one of the work of Luca Ozzano has noticed that fundamentalists always present equality between the sexes, whether that's promoted by the West, in the case of Muslim, Sikh, Hindu fundamentalists, they are anti-Western, or in the case of Christian fundamentalists, a sort of conspiracy of liberal elites to bring about equality between the sexes. they always present this as a threat to women. Equality between the sexes is a threat to women. And the only path to dignity lies in the return to traditional gender roles. Of course, this isn't a return at all. It's a reconstruction. Yeah, that's a really key point. But we talk about fundamentalist movements being modernist movements that are anti-modernity. They're sort of anti-modernity modernist movements. That's a paradoxical feature of them. Why are fundamentalist movements on the rise? Fundamentalist movements have a long history. They've been around throughout the 20th century and 19th. However, they have they've gained hugely in significance, particularly with the collapse of communism. The collapse of communism, we'd say their rise is a consequence of the crisis of the left and secular feminism. Yeah? During the Cold War, they were often sponsored by the CIA as alternatives to left-wing nationalist movements, independent nationalist movements, or communist movements, yeah? Communist parties. They were sponsored, nurtured, and trained. Of course, Afghanistan is the classic example. There's a picture there of the Afghan mujahideen who were given Stinger missiles by Ronald Reagan, and indeed who trained many of the people who later went on to attack America. So the collapse of the Soviet Union, the failure of China to represent an alternative to a global neoliberal order has given a massive boost to fundamentalist movements, which also were anti-communist on the basis that these were secular and godless movements. So that's a key. So that the collapse of communism was seen as a vindication, yeah, of an instance of their success. The triumph of neoliberal capitalism has also weakened working class organisation, weakened social democracy, and massively increased inequalities. And this has destabilised people's lives, precaritized people's lives. As Gilbert Ashkar has argued, neoliberal destabilisation and precaritization, global socio-economic conditions has nurtured what he calls a global retrenchment behind identity markers. Yeah? It's like faced with increasing insecurity, people cleave to identity symbols that appear to offer security. So the associated with the sort of Fukuyama end of history model is the idea that politics is no longer about material questions, but about a collapse of values. And this, of course, is an argument which is shared by a mainstream conservative like Samuel Huntington with his book, The Clash of Civilization. Communitarian philosophy, which had a huge influence on the new Labour government. Tony Blair was a communitarian. And of course it's a shared space with religious fundamentalists, where modernist individualism is seen to embody moral decline. And so in a sense, fundamentalist movements are nurtured by wider forces that create the space for their argument. And a number of people in feminist dissent has created spaces for them to influence social policy. And that will come out in the subsequent case study that we're looking at. So it's important to understand the context of fundamentalist resurgence as an appeal to moral certitude and belonging in an insecure world. Particularly if you're looking at the global south, a key feature of contemporary capitalist development is a huge movement from the rural to the urban, which itself creates massive insecurity. It also disrupts existing social networks, and fundamentalist movements often create a space for reconstructing those. They offer direct support to families in the absence of the state. So all of these things are, in return for support for their agenda. So another question that's very important and that needs to be understood is that while fundamentalist movements have what we've called a neo-patriarchal agenda and are male-dominated at the level of the leadership, those male leaders have realised how important it is to have women's wings and women's sections in order to mobilise women. So they often do mobilise women. And some of the debates that have been had that Rashmi will touch on in the next section is, some have presented these as positive developments for women because they do mobilise women. But we would argue you've got to look at the substantive agenda of these movements to look at what they are actually working around. So, just to sort of sum up the points I've made, it's crucial to understand religious fundamentalist movements as political movements of the right. The language they use of purifying a corrupt society gives them an affinity to fascist movements. In some cases, such as Hindutva, the Hindu fundamentalists, and groups like the RSS in India, they are directly inspired by Nazism, and they cite Hitler and they talk about an idea of race and nation, an exclusivist idea of race and nation. So in some cases, fascist ideas have direct inspiration. They share a sense of a polarised and corrupted world, in which their identities, their culture, their threat, their values are under threat. And the way to defend that centrally concerns what they call the protection of women, what we would argue is the control of women. So the reconstruction of rigidly defined gender roles becomes the means of creating the boundary of the community. The boundaries of the community are constructed across the control of women, women's bodies, women's dress, where women can go, women's freedom, women's rights, all of these things. Women are the symbolic boundary, and that's fundamental to understanding. So this goes right to the heart of questions of freedom, rights, and well-being for women, and also sexual minorities, and heterodox religious minorities as well, I should add. The space for their growth is created by the end of history narrative, which alongside the collapse of communism and social democracy has seen a concurrent weakening of secular conceptions of gender equality. And this is Rashmi will touch on this when talking about forms of social theory, anti-Enlightenment social theory, which has actually picked up that theme of secularism as an oppressive Western-dominated discourse, which must be opposed. The collapse of secular conception of gender equality, we would argue, has created space, a propitious space for fundamentalist arguments. They're also, with the increase of social distress and precariousness as a consequence of the neoliberal global dominance, fundamentalist groups are the beneficiaries of the distress caused by those. The attack on secularism as a colonial discourse, is a shared space between so-called progressive social theory and religious fundamentalists. A very paradoxical formation, which Rashmi will talk about. As a result, politics has moved much more towards the discussion of identities rather than material questions such as employment, jobs, secular conceptions of rights, housing. All of these things are now pushed aside. The material is pushed aside over a discussion of identity. And that's created a sort of politics of cultural relativism. Again, a highly propitious environment for fundamentalist groups to operate in. And finally, it's very important, given that I've described the sort of rise of a very depressing reactionary phenomena, religious fundamentalism, it's very important to understand that fundamentalist movements are being resisted. They are being resisted across the world in different faith traditions by people who have no religious belief and by people who deeply resent the quite colonial imposition of fundamentalist versions of their religion onto them. Fundamentalist movements are ruthless in their attack on people who have different versions of the religion to them. And so it's very important to realise that there is extensive resistance to fundamentalists, often it's not discussed, it's hard for that to be articulated, and that's one of the key tasks we see for the journal Feminist Dissent, to provide a space for those voices. Many often they are women's voices, many often they are gay and lesbian voices, they are often the voices of artists, writers, intellectuals, but increasingly movements that feel they need to be secular. We need a kind of new secularism, and there is that resistance coming. But we see this is going to be a long and painful struggle which requires active analysis, engagement and activism. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll try and pick up on some of the themes that Stephen has just talked about, and particularly towards the end, Stephen talked about the fact that in a lot of these culturalist attacks on secularism, there's a kind of elision of materialist issues of housing, employment, etc. And I want to sort of say that even when those issues are being addressed, there's a sort of surprising absence of linking the dots, making the connections between material issues and cultural ideological issues. And this really has come up for me in the recent sort of reevaluation of the concept of social reproduction, which in the last few years, there have been a slew of books on social reproduction theory. Social reproduction theory, for those of you who may not be aware, is sort of a riposte to dominant economic analysis, that focuses on work primarily as productive, as the work of production. And it attempts to look at the work, for instance, of care, of reproduction, of domestic labor, etc., and sort of to bring that into active analysis. But as I said, it is astounding that much of this work does not really connect, the reevaluation of social reproduction and the production of right-wing ideologies, specifically concerning those of patriarchal religion. So in fact, while race, gender, and ethnicity form key coordinates of, for instance, a recent book, very influential book by Tithi Bhattacharya, it's a collection of essays called Social Reproduction Theory, from which any analysis of cultural reproduction is completely missing. So she talks about the importance of gender, race, and ethnicity, but in sort of very, very limited ways. In fact, there's a quote from her book that I want to read. She says, social reproduction theory raises questions of who constitutes the global working class today in all its chaotic, multi-ethnic, multi-gendered, differently abled subjectivity, what it means to bind class struggle theoretically to the point of production alone without considering the myriad social relations extending between workplaces, homes, schools, and hospitals. So she's making a really key point that we need to look at the myriad social relations extending between workplaces, homes, schools, and hospitals. A wider social whole sustained and co-produced by human labor in contradictory yet constitutive ways. But yet when it comes to actual analysis, the collection of essays, there's not a single essay that really looks at these issues. And the case study that we will be presenting shortly, in fact, precisely links up these different sites of social reproduction. Indeed, this is nothing new. Studies about the role of right-wing women, as Stephen also mentioned, within fascism, whether in Nazi Germany or Christian fundamentalist women in the US or Jewish fundamentalist women in Israel and in the diaspora, Hindu fundamentalist women in India, there are plentiful studies of that. Just to give an example, Atre Sen's account of the working class slums of Bombay tells the story of the women and children of Shiv Sena, which is a militant Hindu supremacist outfit, one of the most radical and violent of Hindu nationalist parties. She shows how the women's front has been instrumental in creating and sustaining communal violence directed primarily against their Muslim neighbors. Sen presents the Sena's women's own rationale for organizing themselves along paramilitary lines, as poor women and children have used violence to create a distinctive social identity, networks of material support and protection from male violence in the explosive environment of the slums of Bombay. Okay, so that what I'm sort of suggesting here is that even when new materialist theories, when new ways of reconceptualizing the relationship between Marxism and feminism, as in social reproduction theory, have been presented, there is this enduring absence of any sort of critical approach in terms of relating work and social reproduction to questions of culture and cultural reproduction and ideology. With the frontal attacks by postmodern, post-structuralist feminism on the category of secularism that Stephen talked about, by such eminent names as the historian Joan Scott, the anthropologist Sabah Mahmood, and Sarah Faris in recent years, who see secularism, in fact, as an integral part of the genocidal project of enlightenment. Many feminists have come to regard religion as a panacea in a hopelessly alienated neoliberal world order, and have sought to recast religious belief as piety, to quote the title of Sabah Mahmood's work on religious Egyptian women. Faced with unprecedented cuts in the social budget and a brutally enforced austerity regime on the domestic front, many in the left have come to see religious fundamentalism as the lone force in the world that seems to challenge the unilateral power of the imperial countries. But cuts in austerity have led to reactionary politics to which social reproduction is key. Right-wing religious ideologies present very detailed plans, in fact, of the gendered division of social reproduction. Okay? So that prominent feminist theorists who seem to have been significantly moved by the war on terror and seemed fascinated by women's participation in religious political mobilizations and their immersion in religious identity politics have been less interested. This is a very interesting lacuna in the impact of fundamentalism on women and sexual minorities. Much academic work as part of faiths literature projects religious groups as important carriers of social capital and providers of welfare support, and also projects religion as cohesive and faith communities as central players in tackling radicalization. They, in fact, reject integration completely as a neo-imperial ideology. So more recently, Sarah Faris, whose book In the Name of Women's Rights has got a lot of press, particularly among left-wing academics, elides the entire question of women's rights and religious fundamentalism in her study of what she identifies as an anti-Islam front. That's the phrase she uses, of far-right nationalist parties in Europe, neoliberal advocates, and some feminists. Now, the feminists she uses as examples are basically straw feminists, people like Hersi Eli and Badinter. I mean, who wouldn't oppose them, right? Who wouldn't find problems, with their very xenophobic, Islamophobic comments? And they are, in some senses, very easy and legitimate targets. But in her entire book, which looks at the French case, there is, for instance, no reference to Mariameh Eli Lucas that Stephen talked about, who's worked with this group called Women Living Under Muslim Laws. So there's no engagement really with feminists on the ground, with engaged secular feminists in her work. Okay, so this is to sort of just give one example of currently very influential work, very fashionable work. She gets space in the Verso blog. Her book has been published by Duke University Press, etc. But there's no space there for any discussion of, the role of religious fundamentalism. In fact, she argues that the oppressive treatment of women any discussion of it is a fig leaf for Islamophobia and patriarchy. In fact, she tries to shut down a discussion of women's rights because she says to talk about that is to give ground to the Islamophobes. And of course, along with this is the critique of enlightenment, as Stephen also pointed out, which is now being dismissed as racist and imperialist. And along with it, I think there's also a dismissal of the concept of rights, and concomitantly a valorization of the popular and of the subaltern. And that has, I think, led to a retreat from a critique of religious fundamentalism and patriarchy, and a willed amnesia towards anti-colonial struggles. I think what we in feminist dissent try to suggest is that, in fact, anti-colonial struggles globally were fought by people throughout the colonized world by wresting concepts of freedom, liberty, rule of law, rights, secularism from the West, right? They argued that these are not the property of the West, right? These are global. I mean, C.L.R. James talks about the fact that, the Haitian Revolution, actually is what gave rise to the idea of rights. It was the first successful revolution by slaves, right? And so there's a kind of elision, amnesia, of that whole history, which we are seeing that is going on. In the UK context, again, as to pick up on what Stephen said, the problems and paradoxes that emerged within the context of Thatcherite ideology at home and resurgent religious political mobilizations across the globe were exacerbated by a new Labour government for whom religious organizations were a critical part of governance. So in the UK, for instance, there's a lot of space given within political official policy to religious groups, and particularly to male leaders from religious groups. And again, this is something missing from Farris's argument. According to her, she doesn't find those examples, worth discussing. These have been more or less followed by successive British governments, all invested in multi-faithism. I think what we've pointed out is that multiculturalism has been replaced by multi-faithism, right? A new religious settlement between former colonial states and their minority ethnic populations. So this comprises a multiculturalist practice based on undemocratic negotiations of the state with an unelected layer of community leaders, often religious men, which has bolstered the power of ethnic minority religious leaderships in the UK over a number of decades. So contrary to sort of left post-colonial, postmodern feminism raising the flag of Islamophobia, we find that, in fact, on the ground of official policy, right, there's a lot of space given to religious fundamentalists and to religious fundamentalist men. And if we actually look at the work of Black and minority ethnic women on the ground, and the case study we will be presenting to you is from the group Southall Black Sisters, who, by the way, in recent months, in fact, at various conferences, are now being labeled racist, right, for raising some of these issues. But they have been dealing with questions of blasphemy laws, faith schools, segregation in schools, right? So the new sort of money that's going into faith schools in Britain, which is legitimizing the segregation of girls and boys in schools, parallel legal systems, sexuality issues, all of these that they are dealing with on the ground, right, is something that is not, being picked up by social reproduction theory and even by new attempts to rethink the relationship between Marxism and feminism. And I think that there is this particular absence is really critical, for the future. If we are to really think about, feminism, in a progressive sense. So I, will conclude there, and yeah. If people have any immediate questions, or should we go on to?
We're happy to take any questions.
Yeah, maybe for.
Okay, thank you very much. What do you think about Islamic feminism and its relationship between Islamic feminism and Islam political Islam?
Yeah. I mean, I feel that if women want to call themselves feminists, they have every right to call themselves that. And I feel it's not up to me to say, that Muslim women or Islamic women cannot be feminists. They can absolutely, be feminists. And I think that we make an important distinction between religious observance and religious fundamentalism. And I think the key thing to stress, as Stephen presented in his account, is that it's a political movement. Religious fundamentalism is a political movement of the right, which uses religious discourse, but it's actually a profoundly right-wing movement, So I personally have no problems with Islamic feminism. If women are speaking, as women of faith, but see themselves as feminists and can find the space within their faith to negotiate and find autonomy and freedom and to make their decisions and choices, more power to them. And I feel I'm absolutely, in no position to say, you're not a feminist, if that is how they want to define themselves. But I think there has to be a consciousness of, that space where faith and feminism do collide, and it's not just with Islamic feminists. It would be the case with Hindu feminists and Jewish feminists. There is a space of collision as well, because, religious traditions historically tend to be patriarchal, although there have been many feminist movements within religion as well. The little bit I know about the long, very patriarchal history of Hinduism, there have been heterodox movements within that, including led by women, by the lower castes, untouchables, and so on. So there is space within religions. But yeah, it's the awareness of that space, where the two may collide.
And I think what I'd add to what Rashmi said is that you need to look at the substantive ideological orientation of these movements. Yeah. Now, if you look at the work of the Pakistani scholar Zia, she has argued that what these movements do is present their version of feminism as more authentic, more sort of culturally situated in the societies that they're from, as opposed to secular feminisms, which are presented as Western. Yeah, mm-hmm. And I think this is where we would question this, because just as Rashmi said, anti-colonial struggles happened throughout the world and wrested these concepts of freedom, equality, rights, secularism from the West. There are very important traditions. So in actual fact, a lot of what the support for Islamic feminism has done is eclipsed secular feminism. So secular feminism has been undermined. Yeah? Mm-hmm. And that leads to a particular shape in terms of feminist struggles. So what Zia argues that feminist struggles will not directly confront the male religious elite, yeah, in the way that secular feminists would have. Yeah? So the actual shape and scope of feminism is inflected through these struggles. These changes in the political agenda of feminism, and that needs to be understood.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think this is a very sensitive subject. It's contradictory, it's complex, and And I myself, I don't know where I stand, because it is something new, not new, but I mean it's a multicultural question, so it is kind of new, at least in Sweden. My first initial question is, how common is this a phenomena of religious fundamentalism as movements in Sweden or in Nordic countries? Because you gave us the UK context.
Yes.
But I don't know. I mean, is there dates on this? I mean, that's my first initial question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do people have? Can we draw on the?
Say something
Yeah.
about Denmark.
Denmark. Yeah.
I call myself a brown feminist in Denmark, and I was called a racist by just, focusing on skin color, because just pointing at it as an issue is seen as division. But I have tried now also to call myself a brown feminist who is a Muslima, meaning a Muslim woman. So I'm trying to, create a space where you can actually criticize your own religious background and the fundamentalism, and be understood as not being a nationalist right wing.
Mm-hmm.
Because we are often put in the same box as that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also about creating a space for women who are actually Muslim, but who do not believe in the way that religion actually has interpreted how women's role is in society.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you could say I'm a progressive woman. I work as a community builder, but still I'm part of the debate in Denmark. But still, when I go back to those so-called ghetto areas and speak with women that I have been working with for years, or that are part of that network, they say the same things as I do. I mean, but we're not listened at, because we are told that we are racist and we are right-wing when we, for instance, go in and debate the burqa, niqab, and say, no, we don't want it here, because we're fighting for liberation of women. So we don't want people to come, fundamentalists, to come and promote it as a virtuous symbol for women.
Mm-hmm.
But we are often interpreted as being right-wing.
I think part of the question, or my question too, is what is the power of such fundamentalist groups in Denmark? Because they are very powerful in the
They're
UK.
very powerful because, as you may know, we just had a burqa ban in Denmark. And what happened was that prior to the ban, we had demonstrations. And I didn't dare to, I wrote about it a year ago, but I didn't dare to go into the debate because actually my friends are left-wing friends and they don't understand me right now. They think that I'm a racist or that I'm Islamophobic and so on. So at the moment, when I went to the demonstrations, of course I asked the women who were there in a niqab, are you wearing this every day? They said, no, only 5 of us do it. We do it in sympathy today. And when I met the men, some of them, they would never force me. They would just charm me to say, hey, sister, why don't you want to be as beautiful as the prophet's wives? The prophet's wives. And they were standing next to those people who I usually demonstrate with when I'm fighting for rights. And I think that's very, very, dangerous. And I don't think that the left wing has understood that these people are not allies.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. You made that argument really well. I mean, I think one of the key things that we're acutely conscious of within feminist dissent is it's very important to carve out a third space where you can cut across these groups. Fundamentalist groupings are becoming very influential. The debate is counterposed between certainly in the UK, but across Europe as well, between far-right groups that present their, their native identities under threat from Islam, yeah, and therefore people on the left feel they have to defend Islam, but the people they're often standing with are those who stand for a very fundamentalist version of Islam, which many Muslims themselves detest. So it's really important to open up political space, and we see this is one of the main things that feminist dissent is trying to do. Give voices to people who are finding it really hard to talk about these issues.
And it's not just the Muslim fundamentalists. I mean, the UK government, that is why sort of we've tried to analyze under the rubric of multi-faithism. So among the Hindu communities, for instance, also the most right-wing, the most fundamentalist Hindu voices are the ones that advised the UK government, which supported they invited Narendra Modi, who's the Prime Minister of India, who, under his watch, there was, thousands of Muslims were killed when he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat. He's feted by the UK government, he's invited and so on. So fundamentalism has become the way in which I think European governments try to manage difference. That if you can keep these communities, that's quite the racist thing. It's like if you can keep these communities under the control of their fundamentalist leaders, we can carry on, with our project.
The whole initiative of communitarianism, which was a huge influence on Tony Blair and the sort of neoliberal attack on traditional social democracy, was introduced on one hand a sort of neoliberal economics, but it wasn't a sort of Ayn Rand, rugged individualism. In introducing neoliberalism, they are very concerned with the social consequences of sort of, making everything a market and the inequalities that are caused by that. I think these things, there's a particular school of neoliberal thinkers who are genuinely concerned by the consequences on people, and they see religion as offering a kind of social glue. Religion's the new form of social capital. You find that a lot of people talking about social capital. Religion offers social capital. Yeah? What we're interested in is the consequences of that, yeah? And what we see is that fundamentalists are able to operate in that space, yeah, as spokesperson of their communities, and that has a very detrimental impact on the freedoms, on the rights, and the well-being of women, girls, gay and lesbian people, heterodox religious minorities.
Yeah. And it's a truly transnational movement as well. I think from Trump's America, when Trump was visiting the UK, he was able to mobilize the Christian right and the far right in the UK. They were talking to each other, they respect each other, the far right in the US, the far right in the UK, the far right in Europe, So so there is a kind of transnational consolidation, I think, of different religious fundamentalisms.
I mean, one of the things that I think feminist dissent has been one of the only groups that has talked about Sikh fundamentalism, in the Sikh community, the rise of fundamentalism. And one of the things I found most chilling is seeing the way there's been the emergence of this former neo-Nazi activist called Tommy Robinson. That's not it. That's his a made-up name, but he presents himself as I'm the person speaking for the ordinary working-class white person. I'm the one who'll tell you the truth that all these politically correct cultural Marxists won't give you. And he is going around the country, being given considerable media space, making blatantly Islamophobic, reactionary arguments. fomenting division and hate. And basically he has been on speaking tours around Sikh Gurdwaras and Sikh temples, by particular fundamentalist Sikh groups who are making a common cause with him against Muslims. So it really shows you the way these groups are working together. It is terrifying that Sikh, you would see Sikh, fundamentalists promoting a neo-Nazi. But this is the kind of, and this brings us back to why we have to understand that analytical category of religious fundamentalism, that religious fundamentalist movements are right-wing political movements. They see their affinity with other right-wing political movements.
Should we present the case study?
Should we?
Yeah.
Are there any sort of burning questions, or we'll go on to our
Yeah,
case
it's
study?
a fascinating case study, and maybe we can just present it and have an open discussion because
Would
of
you like to
the
do that? Or
time, paucity of time, no?
what time do
We only have, how much time do we have?
I think 45 minutes more.
Okay.
Is it ending at 5?
5:30.
Oh,
5:30,
we have
we've got
time.
plenty of
Okay,
time.
sorry.
Yeah.
I was thinking 5, yeah.
No.
Okay,
5:30,
then
we've
you
got
should
plenty of
present
time.
it, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Can I suggest let's look at a case study, yeah? This is a case study that Rashmi mentioned, came from the Black feminist organisation, Southall Black Sisters. I'll give it out, and if you want to have a discussion about it in pairs or threes or something like that.
Were you going to read it out?
And I'll read it
yeah.
out.
Yeah,
let
so
me
we
just
can
give it
all
out.
hear.
This is a true case. Okay, let me read out this case study. Angelina, a Nigerian woman who is a single parent of Christian background, was referred to Southall Black Sisters, a black feminist voluntary organisation based in West London, in 2015. Angela came to Southall Black Sisters regarding the disappearance and possible death of her severely disabled daughter, Blessing, who was 15 at the time. Angelina is herself a vulnerable woman who suffered from multiple difficulties, including domestic violence from her ex-husband, ongoing and complex mental health problems, financial difficulties, in addition to the sudden and serious onset of her daughter's mental illness and her eventual disappearance and presumed death in April 2014. So in April 2014, Blessing was abducted by her brother, Joseph, and taken to Egypt. He converted to Islam while at the university in the UK and was deeply involved in a very fundamentalist practice of Islam. He'd also tried to convert Blessing, his sister, to Islam, even though this went against his mother Angelina's wishes. And also the fact that Blessing herself lacked any real capacity to understand or make sense of what he was trying to do or make informed decisions. During this period, a number of agencies such as Blessing's School assumed that Joseph had parental responsibilities for his sister in a way that seriously undermined what her mother Angelina was trying to do. For example, Joseph would often turn up at Blessing's School and insist that she be covered, or demanding that she be taught by female teachers only. And staff in the school would do that, thinking that that was a cultural belief in minority communities, without thinking about the impact that had on Blessing herself. So to think of the abduction itself, SBS caseworkers considered that it was most likely that Joseph took Blessing to Egypt so he could form Islamic rituals, an exorcism on her. And it was, they believed that during a failed attempt at exorcism that she died, though there has been no independent or forensic evidence of her death and her body that hasn't been found. Due to Angelina's bravery and persistent efforts to find out what happened to her daughter, the police did eventually find Joseph, and he was brought back to the UK. He pleaded guilty to abduction, and he served a sentence of 3 years and 4 months. However, he's refused to discuss the whereabouts of his sister to his mother or anyone else. Angelina remains traumatised, not only by her son's behaviour and complete lack of empathy for her predicament, but by the many questions left unanswered by Blessing's disappearance, including the considerable involvement of social services and the police with her children prior to the trip to Egypt in 2014. And of course there is a serious question as to whether or not their lack of action to safeguard Blessing contributed to her disappearance and possible death. One of the things that they have in the UK with regard to counter-terrorism is something known as the PREVENT program, where they have what's called a de-radicalisation program, where someone would be presented with counter narratives to Islamist fundamentalist views. And Joseph underwent one of those, though Angelina wasn't able to see any of the impact that that had on him, and also she was herself trying to alert the authorities with concerns about his radicalisation, and that prevented him going abroad to Yemen rather than Egypt. So just to sort of summarise the state of things, in 2016 an internal police review and what's known in the UK as a serious case review, which is a report that the police and social services undertake when a vulnerable adult dies in circumstances that may be related to neglect. They look at everything that happened, all documentation, and they look if they could have done things differently. They try and the whole purpose of a serious case review is to learn from mistakes that were made. There was a serious case review into Blessing's case, and it concluded that her death was not preventable. It did, however, consider the complete absence of multi-agency working. And coming back to the point that we've made about the importance of the category of fundamentalism, there was no consideration of the role fundamentalist ideology or organisation played in Joseph's actions. So that's the case. Very powerful, very tragic case. I suppose the question we'd like to pose is, as we've argued in our two presentations, we believe fundamentalism, religious fundamentalisms, have a very significant impact on women's freedoms, on women's rights, and women's well-being. And we'd just be interested in if people have any responses around those. Yeah? Freedom, rights, well-being. Do you have any? Should we have a
smaller group discussion?
Would you rather have a smaller group discussion, or would you just have an open?
Oh, you're a small group anyway.
You are a small group.
Yeah. Okay. So responses to this case. I mean, one thing that struck me here is the role of school and schooling. As I mentioned, although a lot of, critical feminist theory is, I think, often very rightly suspicious of government integration programs, I'm wondering if it is important to think about integration a little differently while acknowledging its centrality. Given that, just to sort of speak from personal experience, I'm an Indian, my partner is Indian, we have a little Indian daughter who goes to school in a London primary school which has children from all over. As a kind of critical feminist theorist, I can see the problems with integration when it's imposed by the government, because yes, it's neo-colonial and it's neoliberal, but on the ground, in terms of practice, I want my daughter to be integrated, so I have this kind of critical hat, where I'm very critical of anything that the British government introduces as policy, On the other hand, if you are there as a migrant, you are sort of caught, in that in-between space where you want your child to be part of it. And I have sort of seen this happen firsthand, right? As it says that it was assumed that Joseph, because there was no father on the scene, that Joseph was her guardian, and he would come to school, and I've seen this happen. Parents coming to school and, saying they want their daughter, a girl in my daughter's class, they're all 9-10-year-olds, has been pulled out of PE classes, because the father came to the school and said, I don't want my daughter to be doing PE. And of course, the school being a progressive, multicultural school, said, okay, fine, as a father, you have the right to do that. And then after a week, my daughter said she'd gone back to PE classes. So there was this kind of, something was going on, both within the family and in the space of the school, which are spaces of social reproduction. So that's what struck me here, is that the problem, as it was working out in the space of the school where blessing was attending.
I think sometimes, I'd like to just address what you're saying about the neo-colonial integration policies and how it works on the ground.
Yeah.
My experience, the first day of my daughter's, first day in school, was that we were in, it's in Nørrebro, it's a very multicultural area, and the school is well known for its huge amount of minority days, you could say. And my daughter's father, he's my ex, and he's majority Dane.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a very mixed setting, and I'm born in Denmark and everything. But I came into this auditorium, and the school headmaster, she said that, listen, parents, now your children have started here, and Ramzan is coming up, the month of fasting,
Mm-hmm.
and your children should not be fasting. And your children should be able to participate in the school, and they have to eat. And what I saw, the reaction to that was that, well, of course I was pointed out, I felt pointed out alongside with the other ones who had brown hair, black hair. And the other thing that happened was also an alienation of some of those parents who were they were not the majority there. They had, majority Danish background, and one of the mothers, she actually panicked and was crying because she felt forced, because her child was, she was given this school. It was from the authorities. It was her school district. So she was at that time, at that moment, considering whether she should become part of that school or not. And it's just to say that we have a
And
conflict.
she was from a majority Dane.
Yeah.
And are those the terms used in Denmark? That's interesting.
It is.
Majority
It is.
Dane.
And I think that even if I wasn't a fundamentalist at that moment, I think I was put in the box. I wasn't even given the chance to become anything else. And people who feel that maybe I don't belong here, or they will tend to, listen to those voices who are stronger in that community, who are organized through religion.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we saw these girls that were actually equal in the beginning. In third class, you could see that if their cousin was in the same class, the boy, he was actually controlling or allowed to be discussing what she was allowed to do. And he was sitting there as a representative.
Mm-hmm.
For
So
her.
they become representatives from very young
And
Yeah.
that was the same class where you saw these clashes, maybe created by the alienation and maybe created by the division, that I would say. And I think that's also, school is a very problematic area.
I mean, you really opened up the sort of the complexity of the issues there. But I think that the what we certainly see in the UK, it would be just an assumption that the school is acting in a sort of progressive way by allowing the brother to tell his daughter, this is what these people do, quote unquote. That's how the teachers think about it.
Yes.
And what they're not considering is the rights of women. They're not considering the impact this has on her, or whether she is capable of understanding or responding to that. And these are the kind of situations that are thrown up. Yes.
I was thinking that now I understand a bit because I've read cases like this before in the UK thing. But in Sweden I've not heard. I know that religious fundamentalism is discussed a lot when honor-related crimes.
Yes.
Yeah.
But just cases such as this, like taking someone that's ill to be converted, it's not. I haven't heard any. There might be, but it's not like a common. But I've read much more in the UK study. But my first thought was that, without relativizing, like making something too relative, what I was thinking is that for him, the brother, it might have been a totally rational thing to do. And with that, I mean, like, in his mind, he thought he was doing the right thing, obviously. He was doing something he took it to a far extent, But in his head, he thought that he was, doing something right. And I think that this is a problem in a setting where a lot of different groups have to get along under the same roof. There must be, of course, some common ground. For example, the recognition that bipolarity is an illness that can be treated with medicine and therapy. So, but there is a contradiction there. I'm just saying that his worldview, and rationality was probably in his world the right thing.
To build up my mind, there is missing any information about the son. What was his age when he came?
He was older than her.
And what's his age now? How many years older than his sister?
Several years older.
So Blessing was 15 in 2000.
And 14.
So
So he was at university,
He had-
so he would have been like, what,
in his
6,
early
7 years
20s.
older than her, something like that.
Yeah. We've extracted this from a much longer piece
Yeah.
written by them. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that as human beings, and probably in this setting, we would like to know the perspectives of these people.
Yeah.
And the boy. That's very empathetic, but I'm thinking instead of understanding that it would be normal in his mindset, I would rather like the school to be a place where children are children and students are students, and where you really use your mind and think about it. Then he was actually seen as her father. But it doesn't really correlate with the age, if he was 7 years older than her. I mean, you need to have a stand where you say, children are children here. So in order to treat children like children, we can't just explain it by saying, well, we understand him, and of course he is trying to protect her, that's why he's doing this and that.
The safeguarding
Maybe,
aspect.
he thought that she would be cured by taking her and doing some rituals, but he didn't, that's what he probably thought,
Yeah, but as the case workers found out that he was part of a fundamentalist religious outfit, so it wasn't just that, on his own he thought, let me take her to Egypt and try this. He's part of an organized group, that leads him to make that decision.
What was the role of Angelina as mother? Did she someone show up at the school because if there is a lack, nobody from the family shows up at the school. I can understand the school that if the only representative is the brother, they will accept him as the responsible of the family. And in Germany, often it is that the sisters or brothers, they are better capable in German language and can have an intense dialogue with the teachers, while the mother stays in the background if she is showing up. So in this case, it is in help for the family if the brother would do that.
Mm-hmm. I think she's been wanting to. Let's get some comments.
Yes, I want to say what's me bothering most in the story is that also the authorities and the police were not active, because Angelina tried to alert them and they did not react and they did not support her. This is very frustrating. And I think we have this situation also, there are cases in Germany too where we have such situation that the police is not protecting and that it's not going to become active, because even if the mother says something is going wrong with my son, I don't think that it's easy for a mother to go to the police and say, my son is...
Yes, for a Nigerian mother to go to a British...
For all mothers, not easy to go to mother and alert them about what the son is doing. I mean, I'm not mother, but I cannot imagine that.
Absolutely. It's a very pertinent point. I mean, just to say as well, you know, the one of the things that came out of the series case review, and because there's wider documentation about this case, but one of the things that came out of the series case review was the police were only really concerned if there was an immediate, if he was going to be involved in an actual terrorist incident. So the fact that he was taking his daughter, her sister, away to another country, abducting his sister, they didn't really do anything about that. They were aware that it might be a possibility. They didn't act on it. Their fundamental focus was, is he going to blow up a train or something like that? And so there's a way in which there's a kind of security agenda there, which is completely separated off from understanding the relationship of sort of religious fundamentalism is understood as, in the UK by the police, as a security issue. It's not understood as a rights, freedom and well-being issue. And that's the kind of thing we are trying to argue for. We need to see fundamentalism as, you know, it's an organised political force which has a particular agenda about the protection of women. But a case like this shows you that protection is an attack on the sort of rights, freedom and well-being of women, of girls and women. Sorry, did you want to ask?
So what I was wondering is, what is the reason for such behavior of the authorities? Because one could think that it is privileges for religious groups that are in legislation in some countries, in Germany too. The other thing is, in Germany, what I see, that if the authorities would permit this to happen, then probably the person in the authority would permit it because of the fear of being called a Nazi. So this works very well in Germany. So if you do not do what they want you to do, then you are called a Nazi, and this will bring you quite some problems if you are working in authority. So is this the same in the UK, or so is this an idea of integration to let another subculture do what they want to do?
This multi-faithism,
or is it just the fear of being called a Nazi or something else which would cause problems?
I think there are two aspects to it. One is that you've brought up, I think, very powerfully. It operates in the UK as well. But the other is, again, austerity, the there's been a spate of bombings and attacks in London. And, the mayor has pointed out the severe cuts in policing and, in those kinds of authorities. So for all we know, they don't have, the workforce, the police force, to look at other things. All they have is, resources for tackling immediate threat.
Yeah.
So I think that it's both of those issues.
I mean, I think the point you make is a very pertinent one. Yeah, I think it comes back to what Rashmi was saying about multi-faithist governance. That basically it is assumed that minority communities are seen to be communities with religious identity. Yeah. So therefore, the people who speak on behalf of these communities are religious people. Now, very often, there's a very uneven level of religious observance, and there are many people within those communities who don't want to be spoken for by these conservative religious leaders. But that's the way. That is a problem for what's called multi-faithist governance, and very often these fundamentalists are very adept at playing this, and will criticise secular forces within their own communities as collaborating with the authorities, as not authentically of the community, and that's a very powerful way of silencing anyone who criticises them, and that would include other workers as well who might be asking questions about this. Yeah.
Sorry. I was thinking, I have a group called Postcolonial Perspective, and a big group, and these questions are brought up continuously, like religious fundamentalism, etc. But I think that what I've noticed is that because Europe is so Islamophobic in so many ways, constantly, daily, and it's like leftists are constantly trying to protect themselves from racist attacks, So I noticed that I think that we can agree on the fact that religious fundamentalism exists. Okay, it exists in many forms, and it's patriarchal violence. So we can agree on that. Mm-hmm. That's a common ground. But then, how do we fight it? That is one of the divisions I can see. For example, a lot of people try to. How can we talk about this issue without becoming racist or stigmatizing already groups that are already stigmatized? Or how can we, for example, talk about violence, this type of violence, without seeing the victims as passive and not like passive victims of their culture? Mm-hmm. There's so many questions that I think that we should redirect ourselves towards.
I think absolutely that's so crucial. That's the political work we need to do.
Absolutely.
And it's very risky. That's what we meant. And I think yes, that's the common ground. We agree that there's religious fundamentalism. We also agree that there's a great deal of Islamophobia in Europe. I think we have to agree on that, both of those common grounds, right? But I guess the point I was sort of trying to make is that as feminists, post-colonial, secularists, how is it that the left has come to defend religious fundamentalism, and defend religion in ways, in the history of left movements, there's been a lot of, either neglect of it, or there's always been skepticism. And there is suddenly this embrace of religion and religious groups as doing the work of the left, that they are going to take on US imperialism, right? So let's sort of stand behind them. I mean, so parties like the Respect Party or Stop the War Coalition in the United Kingdom have openly allied with fundamentalist religious groups because they see them as opposing US imperialism. So, we both have the same enemy, so let's be allies. How has it come to this, right? And I think that that is our political challenge, is to create that space where we can be critical of all kinds of authoritarianism, of fundamentalism, of racism, of Islamophobia, you know, that space to say those things. And I think that's what we are trying to do. Because many of our writers have long, extensive histories of fighting racism. Southall Black Sisters, you know, who are now being called Islamophobic. You know, they've been there, I mean, they're celebrating 30 years?
Yeah.
Next year, 30 years of their formation. The left formation was in the anti-racist movements of the UK,
Yeah.
right? So how have we come to this,
Yeah.
and how can we, create space?
Let me give you a very simple answer to your question. Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Rashmi said. I think the answer is, and this is my belief, people on the left need to make explicit political arguments. Yeah, I think that is the answer. We need to say, this is fundamentalism, this is what it stands for. This is fascism, this is what it stands for. Yeah, and we need to, that is the history of Marxism, that is the history of feminism. That's the Marx who said the criticism of religion is the beginning of all criticism, a phrase that the left has slightly forgotten. I think we have to make explicit political arguments, and I think we have to see the affinity between neo-fascist Islamophobes and religious fundamentalists.
We have to show the links.
Yeah, the way they are akin to each other as authoritarian, right-wing, misogynistic movements.
Yeah.
Yeah, like both during the presentation and discussion, it was very clear that it's the religion that provides philosophical justification for all the religious fundamentalist movements, because religion is a tool of mass domestication, both at the public level and at this private sphere. So it's important to see how religion provides these philosophical justifications in terms of mass domestications. So religious fundamentalists use that ideological framework of mass domestication of individuals in the private sphere and in public sphere to control women more than men, because most of the religions have unequal power relations in terms of gender relations. So therefore it's important to also critique all religions, as progressive forces.
Yeah, that's a dilemma, I think, that is also there, because to be critical of religions when they become political, right? Versus the space of religious faith, right? Do we attack religious faith itself, or do we attack religion in its political? Yeah, I mean, that's something I struggle with, yeah.
Well, I would just, advise not to always take the easy way by saying that it's something about religion. Because if you do that, I mean, in the Western societies, of course, you are always and constantly provided with arguments against Islam. You're never given arguments that differentiate between fundamental, political, fanatic Islam and what the majority of Muslims believe in.
Yes, that's
because
a crucial
they are
point.
silenced,
Yeah.
they are not, because they are anonymous in these societies, they're never promoted as, as something that's a success. So I think that you can talk about Islam, everyone thinks that's my claim, as if you talk about the weather. And you're not an expert. So if you don't have representatives who actually know something about religion, who are talking about it, I mean, women who would talk about Islam, and if you even listen to them, they would say that a lot of those misogynist things that are promoted by fanatics, they're not part of the Quran even. I mean, they can easily give you those arguments, but we never look at them. We never let them be represented.
I completely agree with your
Yeah.
point. But when I was talking of religion as a tool of mass domestication, I was just particularly looking at Hindu religion, which I know the best. You see the kind of social discrimination you have in Hindu religion in terms of caste, and you have gender division of labor in terms of Varma theory. So the Hindu religion looks diverse. Most of the Western scholars looks at Hindu religion as if it's very democratic, whereas Christianity and Islam is undemocratic, because you have 333 million gods and goddesses. You have both black and white. It's a free market. You have real free market and free choice of gods and goddesses. So what provides the uniqueness in Hindu religion is Bhagavad Gita, the songs of God, that brings together different Hindu traditions within a kind of theological premise, which is completely similar, a monolithic philosophical tradition as it exists within Islam and in Christianity. So the philosophical justification that Bhagavad Gita, the songs of God, provides, that really gives philosophical justification for gender discrimination and social discrimination based on caste hierarchy. So therefore, without making a fundamental critique of religion, it's a difficult road for the progressive forces. It's a difficult road for the left politics. But it's important to have a clear political project, as Stephen was talking about, that you can follow your religion and all that progressive thoughts that carries, but these are reactionary thoughts.
Yes.
And you engage with the popular culture, with progressive ideals, and isolate the reactionary tendencies. And in the process, you create a kind of society which is progressive without religion. That would be the best idea.
Lots of more questions, please go. Yeah.
So I want to say now continue because I think maybe the situation is different in Germany because we differentiate between Islam and Islamism. If there's an act of terrorism anywhere in the world, one of the first things also conservative party politics are saying that it has nothing to do with Islam but only with Islamism. So I think the situation is different. So because we differentiate too much sometimes. And I want to come back what you said because yes, we should also criticize religion itself. I think it's the beginning of all critics. And I'm an activist in the field of secularism, and we are doing only critics, or mostly, on our own religion. So we are only criticizing the Catholic and the Christian Church.
Yes, yes.
And we are informing about the missing division between state and religion in Germany. And well, we get a lot of, also from Muslims, really bad responses. So we are, and although we are not discussing with them, yes, I'm a little bit frustrated because I don't know how to deal with fundamentalists. Because I'm standing here as a single person with one single fundamentalist in front, and it's not easy. It's not possible to talk to him or to her. It's strictly not possible.
No, that's so resonant, and just to again give anecdotal sort of evidence, I was talking to a friend from Pakistan who, there were some people visiting him, and one was this very fanatical fundamentalist guy, and I was talking to my friend about the Hindu fundamentalists, and he's like, what's wrong? He actually completely identified with the Hindu fundamentalists. You would think that they would be on opposite ends of the spectrum, but it was the same structure of thought, right, that informs both or all fundamentalisms. So there's, in fact, an affinity between different fundamentalisms, and that is something that we should also be pointing to, that they actually get each other, they understand what the project is.
Just to give an example of that, if you look at the UN forums where issues of women's control, control of their own bodies, birth control, abortion, fundamentalist groups actually collaborate together, work
Yeah.
together.
Yeah,
Even
the
though in other
Vatican
forums
collaborates.
They're attacking each other
Yeah.
as apostates and hateful. They will actually collaborate together in those particular forums. You know, Christians working with people, Muslims, Sikhs and stuff like this, you know, in opposition to women's rights or gay and lesbian rights. So I think that they share a mindset, yeah, of a Manichaean worldview. Yeah, I think it's a very fundamental point about them. So did you want to say something? Yeah, please do.
Sorry for a broken English. I think so. The first one, we should change the set of the concepts that we use when we talk about, for example, fundamentalism or religious fundamentalism. So it's so important to use political Islam and to change with Islam. So to change the concept of the Islam with political Islam, because it's very important to unmask the ideological character of this movement. If we continue to talk about Islam, so we cannot unmask the political aspect of this movement, ideological aspect of this movement. So it's so important, and also to change, for example, to change and to use always in different way, but we understand when we say Occident, when we say, for example, culture, secularism, or colonization. So, for example, to understand colonization,
colonialism,
colonization.
Yes, colonization, in different way of the capitalist reproduction relationships. So is just say to one of the phase of the historical phase. So it's not true.
Yes.
So this kind of the use of the concepts in the especially post-colonial feminist theory is really, really dangerous. Really, really dangerous.
very dangerous.
And Islamophobia is not a moral issue also. It's also ideological,
Political.
issue, and exactly. It's one of the representation of the rise of the political movement of the right.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
to change this kind of the
Vocabulary.
uses of the concept is so important.
It is very important.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think so the transformation of the knowledge and also reality to start living here.
Yeah. I mean, just to give you an example, when I do those kind of things, one of the things I try to make very clear. So when I'm talking to my students about this, one of the things I try to make clear that the victims of Islamic fundamentalism are primarily and overwhelmingly other Muslims. Yeah, the dominant view in the West is that it's the West that's under attack from these things. Actually, if you look at a very important writer like Karima Benoon, who's written a really good book about this called "Your Fatwa is Not Welcome Here." It's a fantastic
It's
book.
a
and
brilliant
I strongly
book.
recommend
Your
you to read that book.
does not belong here.
Does not belong here. Your fatwa does not.
Your
belong.
fatwa does not belong here.
Okay.
Karima Benoon.
And she,
Karima Benoon.
yeah,
Benoon.
We'll-
Yeah,
we'll
she's
write
an
it down for you.
Algerian.
She makes very clear. There's a fantastic TED talk from her where she talks about all these issues.
Maybe I can write it down.
Yeah. And she makes it very clear that something like 85% of the victims of Islamic fundamentalism across the world are other Muslims. It's not Westerners under attack.
Yes.
It's Muslims who question the authoritarian and brutal and violent aspect of fundamentalism. Who are the victims?
And it's not a new movement for, I was born in Turkey, so I really know how is the Islamic fundamentalism, because it is in the rising in my country.
Yes.
Okay, I don't live in there since 2007, but I also live in there.
Yeah,
It's so impossible to live Absolutely no. But is there, I think so, is there a really interesting thing, because when we talk about this kind of issues with feminists, I live in Catalonia, and it's European feminists. It seems really strange, because they don't think about the Islamic fundamentalism when they, for example, make activism against Islamophobia. So,
Yes.
so it's so interesting, this kind of not integral knowledge, not
Yes, very
integral
true.
understanding of the world
Yeah,
and life.
very true.
So it's I think so it's a really necessary and really important thing. Firstly, to be feminist, because suffer Muslim women.
Yes,
First
and
one is-
it's crucial, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think this is another point that the left is completely ignoring, that basically this is a project for controlling women. The left is not in allying themselves, they're completely failing to look at the impact on women.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you see that there are contradictions for I think a lot of us. Because I feel this contradiction that you're talking about, that why isn't the left speaking up? But I think it's because a lot of the times, myself, I sometimes defend a man of color over a white feminist. I can do that because there is a contradiction there, because there's racism and there's anti-patriarchy, and then patriarchy. So sometimes we choose sides, you know, and it's like, for example, my father, just an example, he's been through a lot of racism in Sweden. And sometimes
Where is he from?
He's from Chile.
Uh-huh.
From Chile. But he's indigenous, he's from Mapuche, Chile.
Right.
So I feel like, and he might be macho, but I choose to defend him against racists. And not his machness, for example, or his patriarchal views. Do you understand my perspective?
Yes, yes.
So there is contradiction, and I think this is partly a little bit maybe have to do with it, because it's we see so many contradictions from the far right. You know, there's white men who are saying, oh, they're being religious Islamic are being bad against women in Sweden. But then it's like, since when do you care about women?
Yes.
That's right.
There is
Yeah.
contradictions there.
Yes,
Yes.
definitely. And I think you have to
Absolutely.
expose those right-wing arguments precisely in the way that you're doing. You know, because they are again a form of, you know, the right-wing arguments are, we have to defend our women, our white women, against Muslim men who are trying to do these horrible things to them. Again, that's a, you know, there's a patriarchal argument there. They're not your women. Do you know what I mean? And it's
Yeah.
like this is
My question is, why can't you do both?
yeah.
Because this was precisely the dilemma of feminist movements in the anti-colonial period, nationalist period, you know, where women were told, ally with us, once we get independence, once the nation becomes independent, then you fight for your women's rights. And of course, once independence came, women's rights were, it happened in the case of India and of, you know, so many other situations. So I think that is one of the insights we can take from contemporary feminist theory, is this idea of articulation, that these, you know, are articulated, that your father being patriarchal, but also the victim of racism, and women being the victims of patriarchy, but racially, you know, superior. We can connect the dots. It doesn't have to be either or. It doesn't have to be, you know, some kind of a hierarchy of oppressions, you know.
My father used to support Hindu Fundamentalist, and it took 10 years. You know, I had 10 years engagement with him to make him feel that you have to leave in Fundamentalist group, and he left. It took 10 years, and we had constant battles during the lunch. You can love your father, disagree with his politics, and sometimes you can, you know, fight both.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
I also think that if the feminist movement is stronger and maybe creates that third place, then third space, I
Mhm.
mean, it would not stop progression as it is right now, because
Yes.
right now
It's a standstill.
it's the
yeah.
standstill because the left, the right wing has sold fear, so we have taken it,
Yep.
and we have fear of saying what we are seeing. I mean, in Denmark you can see girls age 7 wearing headscarves. I mean, that's not something that derives out of religion.
That's right.
Mhm.
And all the discussions about circumcision, maybe we think that we have to defend circumcision, but who is asking the mothers? Who's asking the mothers of the children? Maybe the mothers and the young fathers, I discussed with them, they would like to have a different perspective on it, and that is that of the child's care
Yep.
and the children's rights, and things develop, but by not allowing these discussions to be nuanced and representative, we are actually blocking development and progression.
Mhm.
Excellent point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think
It's really
that's,
sad.
and I think it's implicit in what you said that there is a universality to rights when you talk about children's rights, children's well-being.
Mhm.
What are the things that contribute to children's flourishing in the world? Yeah, and I think that's a universal question. Yeah, we've lost a set. We
We've
really
lost,
have lost
with
the
the
sense
attacks
of,
on universalism
Yeah,
as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
we've lost that sense of the universal. That's often presented as something imperialistic, and that's not to say we don't want to go back to a notion of a sort of European universalism, but there is always an inclusive conception of the universal, a radical universal.
Yeah, these are, I mean, tough things to teach.
Yeah.
So when, in my class I'm teaching this, most often students will raise their hand and they'll say, but rights is so Eurocentric.
Yeah.
And, the whole idea of rights, it's from the Enlightenment. And then, there's a wonderful piece written by one of our collective members in Open Democracy, where she looks at who wrote the UN Declaration for Human Rights. These were third world women. In fact, the very first sentence of it was written by an Indian anti-colonial feminist, and so there's some very fascinating research now, that's coming out on the writing of that document, So I think that's the kind of work we have to do, to disentangle, what has become the new orthodoxy, which is that rights, freedom, secularism, reason, science, these are all Eurocentric. They're genocidal, in fact. And I think to show the much more complex histories, that's, I think, something that pedagogically I've found useful to do.
The case is that these human rights, they were misused by the
Yes.
Western states.
Yes.
And they caused wars in the name of human rights, causing so many deaths of people. And it was for their own profit. And
That's right.
Yeah, I mean,
for
as,
their own
yeah.
power. And all of these in the name of human rights and bringing girls to schools and like that. Yeah, this is why now the use of human rights is a kind of critical.
Yeah, I think that it has become a notion that is seen as something that's top down. A lot of people see, that there are these big agencies who are determining and deciding, who has rights and who doesn't, and who should be rescued, and all of that. And as you were saying that, you found that interesting about Gayatri Spivak's talk yesterday, where she talks about how these need to be democratized through public education.
Woven into the fabric of everyday life, I think was her phrase, which I really like.
Yeah, and I like the emphasis on teaching and pedagogy in her talk, that a lot of this work can perhaps be done in the classrooms, because she said that in the schools that she's teaching in remote West Bengal, they haven't even heard the word rights, so how do you teach that?
Teaching is also becoming very difficult.
Very.
For example, when I was teaching in Glasgow University, I was teaching a program called Issues in World Economy. And one of the lectures is aid and trade.
Mm-hmm.
And in aid and trade, when I teach about how majority of American aid goes to Israel, not to the needy, so-called needy African states or people, it goes to the defense industry, it goes to Israel. And I was not doing a very philosophical analysis. I was just showing the statistics. Mm-hmm. And there was a Jewish student who complained to the university, saying Bhavani spoke against Israel and to Israel. So I was called by the dean. I said, listen, all is uploaded in the blackboard. You just go and see. So that lecture was taken out from my program.
Yeah.
So the dean did not take any step on me. The investigation stopped. And I did not teach that model next year. So the dean said,
yes,
Bhavani, your talk was too radical and few Jewish students complained. So the point is, this is a very difficult period.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So there is nothing to be politically correct also becoming very difficult.
Yeah.
I think it's
the no
absolutely
platforming
right.
thing as well.
The no platforming at Warwick University was used against an Iranian secularist, Mariam Namazi, who is an atheist, but she is of Muslim descent, and she was talking about the abuses of power by a theocratic state. She was no platformed by the Warwick University Students' Union, who thought this would have a detrimental impact on Muslim students. I mean, I think we really got confused about some really fundamental issues, and I think the kind of material that Rashmi was talking about, the way in which identity politics the way we've lost that sense of the universal, of the overall, and I think as Marxists as well, of the material. This seems to be something we really need to go back to so much. Marx teaches us that social being determines consciousness. We've really lost the sense of that. We focus instead on these very idealized identities as though they determine who you are. It's everything Marx was criticizing, and yet the left is kind of going along with all this.
I think, Stephen, I have a little difference with you. I would have agreed with you 10 years back. I was completely opposed to identity politics. But right now, I think, left should engage with identity politics. I don't see identities are abstract identities. They're relational, they're material, and they have material foundations. And identities are relational. I relate with you as
and
a
contingent,
ideological. So therefore, left has made a blunder by not engaging with identity politics in a progressive manner. Identities are relational and material. Being a brown man in British University, I face double the problem you face as a white man.
Yes.
So therefore, by left engaging with me as a brown man, it's not losing anything. In promotions, I'll tell you, in applications for senior fellowship in higher education academy, I have to submit 4 case studies, whereas my colleagues who are white will submit 2 case studies. In promotions, I have to prove myself twice than my fellow white colleagues. I have nothing against my white colleagues. They are lovely human beings. But structurally, I face discrimination. So my identity is fundamental to my material understanding of my politics.
It can go the other way too, I think. I think that, I'm wondering, I don't have a position on this, whether this issue cannot be addressed by looking at through the lens of discrimination and unequal access and unequal rights.
Which is a material question.
Which is a
rather
material
than from the question of
question.
identity.
Because there are lots of brown people who occupy token positions at the highest echelons of the academy. That's what Spivak was saying, right? So you have brown people from the most elite backgrounds in third world countries who come to the West and occupy the position of being the token brown person, you know, and there's a lot of capital, social capital there that they encash, right? So, yeah, so I think that there's a, you know, there's a, pardon?
Not in Germany, there are only
In the-
white men.
Yeah, in the US, I think she was talking about the US Academy where, you know, Gayatri Spivak, Homi Bhabha, Edward Said, they all occupied, you know, those positions. But she always makes it a point, but don't take this at face value. So, yeah, so that's, it's a tricky, yeah, yeah.
I don't know the academic terms, but
Mhm.
I'm thinking what you're talking about is, and what's harming you is the narrative about the brown man.
Mm.
It's not,
Interesting.
I don't think it's about your identity, it's
Yeah.
about the narrative that's bigger than you.
Yeah.
I mean, so you can't really fight the narrative.
Or you have to fight the
Oh,
narrative.
Yeah, not
Yeah.
alone, I mean, you
Yeah,
can't do it
you
alone.
can't do it
That's
alone.
impossible.
Yeah.
So you need a crowd, you need to be allied with someone because you will never be heard.
That's why I'm saying identity is relational. It's not abstract. My identity with state
And it's linked to,
it's ideological. We have material foundation. We face the same management.
yeah.
That's the material foundation in which we work together.